We now move on over to Europe, and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky announced that Ukraine may explore the possibility of co-producing Rafale fighter jets with France in the future. This comes after he signed a deal with France for 100 Rafale fighter jets to enhance Ukraine's defensive capabilities against Russia. Zelensky's remarks were made during a visit to Paris, where he met with the French President Emmanuel Macron to discuss military support and diplomatic efforts to end the war. Macron expressed hope that peace between Ukraine and Russia could be achieved by 2027, emphasizing France's continued financial and military backing for Kyiv. Macron also confirmed a major contract with French company Alstom, valued at 475 million euros, which is part of Ukraine's broader push for EU integration. Additionally, Macron reiterated his confidence in Zelensky's efforts to combat corruption and strengthen Ukraine's rule of law as part of EU membership processes. Joining us now to discuss this is Dr. Asta Chadha. She's at Ritsu-Meidkan University and she's a professor of international relations. She joins us live from Kyoto. Thank you very much for joining us, Dr. Chadha, here on NewsX World. President Zelensky says Ukraine could eventually co-produce these jets with France. Realistically, how feasible is that when Ukraine's defense is still under attack on nearly a daily basis by Moscow?
Thank you, Thomas, for having me here on NewsX. I mean, see, if you read the letter of intent that was signed, it's a long-term deal. It's a 10-year-long aspiration on part of Ukraine to develop those capabilities, but also it's a very long-term political commitment on part of France. So it's not just a short-term military aid that France is providing. Now, given the fact that they are aiming at a 2027 possible peace, I think more than the peace aspect, what's highlighted through this deal is that France and a lot of other European partners, the so-called coalition of the willing European partners, they are willing to embolden and make sure that Ukraine has its own defense capabilities, right, in the longer term, because looks like none of these players are expecting a peace anytime soon. As far as the possibility of Ukraine being completely independently capable of developing those defense capabilities, I mean, I think it's going to take more than a decade for sure. Like you said, it's been under attack for a long time. That being said, there are other smaller steps that are being taken within this letter of intent, and one of those is joint co-development of drones, for instance. I mean, those are the kind of capabilities that would take lesser time to develop, and I'm sure, I mean, given that there is a lot of political monetary commitment on part of Europe as a whole and France in particular, I'm sure that's what they're looking at. And then the third aspect of this deal is the fact that US, and especially under President Trump, has consistently mentioned that European partners need to take more burden of this. So this should be seen as the European way and the French way of assuring both United States and Ukraine that their long-term European security is it's going to be a function of long-term Ukrainian security.
Yeah, and how significant is it that Macron's commitment that peace with Russia could be possible by 2027? Is that diplomatic optimism here?
I mean, yes, it does sound like a little too much of optimism, because remember that last time there was a dialogue held with regard to the Russia-Ukraine conflict, Russia was not even party to that dialogue. And I mean, realistically speaking, unless both the parties that are engaged in this conflict are brought to the table and, the terms of peace are discussed, it's very unlikely that a long-term sustainable peace can be achieved. Though something in the short run, such as, some sort of a halt to a temporary one to the conflict is possible, but that does not guarantee a long-term peace in any way. So I do not think they have whether they are sure whether by 2027 this can be achieved. For sure, what can be achieved is more commitment, both monetary, political, by Europe, probably roping in United States for further commitment into Ukrainian security, and possibly launching new dialogues or launching new platforms wherein Russia is brought as a stakeholder in the long-term European conflict rather than being treated as an outsider.
Yes, Dr. Chadha, do stay with us as we have further updates coming out of West Asia. This time, and Syrian authorities plan to hand over jihadist fighters from China's Uyghur minority to Beijing, as Damascus Foreign Minister Assad al-Shabani makes his first visit to China. Many of the Uyghur fighters joined the Turkestan Islamic Party in Syria after the 2011 war, primarily in Idlib province. A Syrian source said Damascus intends to transfer the fighters in batches, with China rejecting their integration into Syria's new army. Reports indicate that around 400 Uyghurs could be handed over in the coming period. China's top diplomat Wang Yi expressed support for Syria in achieving peace, while China's foreign ministry confirmed that Syria has pledged not to allow its territory to be used against Chinese interests. The Syrian Observatory for Human Rights says between 3,200 and 4,000 Uyghur fighters remain in Syria, some integrated into the new army as a division. Joining us once again is Dr. Chadha. Damascus now to hand over these Uyghur fighters to China. Is this about counter-terrorism or about something else?
Absolutely. I mean, I think you hit the nail on its head. I mean, this looks less like, I mean, if we follow what has been China's relations with Syria, if you take a long-term view, you'll notice that China has been very less interested in the peace per se in Syria and more interested in these fighters and East Turkestan Islamic Movement fighters, specifically the ones that have been integrated into the army or that have made their ways into the defense and the security forces of Syria, because, they do pose a huge security threat to China, specifically given its own internal conditions with regard to Uyghur population. That's one. Two, given that China was very hesitant in January 2025 to recognize the Syrian government in transition, the fact that China is now ready to cooperate with them, specifically calling for an inclusive political transition in Syria, shows that they are very much invested in this security and in this particularly anti-terrorism aspect of Syria rather than long-term Syrian security within or any democratic movement.
Yes, and Dr. Chadha, China has said that Syria has pledged not to allow its territory to be used against Chinese interests. What does that actually mean in practice?
Yeah, I think China's concern, like I mentioned, was, to try and push this anti-terrorism cooperation with Syria and Syrian government in transition, specifically aiming at its broader strategy of playing more active role in Middle Eastern politics and diplomacy. That's one. And second, the closer the cooperation in terms of anti-terrorism, the higher, the Chinese weight in terms of making sure that Uyghur-linked terror groups, do not get the kind of leverage they have previously received in Syria in any way. And third, by doing this kind of a, this sort of a probably a medium-term anti-terrorism cooperation with the Syrian government in transition, China would most probably try and tie together its any future aid or infrastructure investments to this counter-terrorism cooperation rather than for development or very, economic-focused cooperation in Syria.
Yes, and of course, Chinese government and the Uyghurs have an extremely complicated relationship with some serious accusations against the Chinese government. What do we know about the fate of these fighters once they are transferred to China? Do you think there'll be any guarantees against abuse or forced disappearances?
I mean, it's anybody's guess. We've all heard the news that has come out of China, specifically with regards to, Xinjiang and the Uyghur population. So, if China really does look at these fighters more as terrorists or people trying to in some way disrupt the domestic peace, they would probably be dealt with exactly the way the rest of the population is being dealt with inside China. But, one more important aspect of this is if China were to actually get this deal and get, those fighters into the Chinese territory and then have the right to treat them the way it does treat dissidents or anyone trying to disrupt, domestic order, this would in some way seal an alternative to Western-led security order, because, China's engagement in Syria and specifically in terms of counterterrorism would be seen as both political and as well as, long-term security related. And this, in a way, does provide or does showcase that China has its own idea of, the aspect of its own sovereignty, but plus the extent to which it wants to practice this non-interventionist principle, as long as any dissidents or anyone that China considers as a terrorist or somebody who's a threat is transferred, and as long as they can strike those kind of deals with very vulnerable states across Middle East.
Yes, Dr. Chadha, thank you very much for joining us. It's always a pleasure to have you here on the programme. We now move on, and gunmen from a criminal gang have kidnapped 25 people and killed a staff member in an early morning raid on a northwestern Nigerian girls' school. The latest attack comes more than a decade after nearly 300 girls were abducted from Chibok in the restive northeastern region and sparked international outcry. Since then, there has been a string of other abductions involving school children. As per the local police, the armed gang with sophisticated weapons shooting sporadically stormed the government girls' comprehensive secondary school in Kebbi State. The deputy school head was also shot dead while a security guard was injured during the abduction. The police have said that the military, police, tactical units and local vigilantes have been deployed in the area and that they are currently combing the bandits' routes and nearby forest in a bid to rescue the abducted students and arrest the gangs.